Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to people joining us from around the US and around the world, and welcome to today's event. My name is Stephen Small. I'm a professor in the Department of African American Studies, and I'm the director of the Institute for the Study of Societal Issues, ISSI, here at UC Berkeley. ISSI is home to the Center for Right-Wing Studies, and that center has played a vital role since it was founded in 2009, a vital role in fostering scholarship on the right. This year, the Center has taken the ambitious and much needed role of starting the Journal of Right-Wing Studies, and I'm so pleased that you've joined us for today's launch event. Many people have played a role in starting the journal, and you will meet some of them today. I'd like to take a moment to single out in particular Dr. Larry Rosenthal, who is the chair of the Center and the editor-in-chief of the journal. Dr. Rosenthal has taught at UC Berkeley in the sociology and the Italian studies department, and he was a Fulbright professor at the University of Naples in Italy. He has studied the right wing in the United States and in Italy and elsewhere, and is currently working on a study of the contemporary American right in comparison to movements of the right in 20th century Europe. Dr. Rosenthal is the author of Empire of Resentment, Populism's Toxic Embrace of Nationalism. He's the co-editor of Steep, The Precipitous Rise of the Tea Party, and of The New Nationalism and the First World War. His work has appeared in numerous publications, including Populism, The Nation, The New York Times, The San Francisco Chronicle, Foreign Policy, and many others. I'm deeply appreciative of Dr. Rosenthal's work on behalf of the Center and of the journal. And now I'll turn it over to you, Larry. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Stephen, for your very kind introduction, and also for serving on the board of the Journal of Right-Wing Studies. As you mentioned, it's a group effort. We have been working intensively for about a year to launch the journal. I want to mention a few people who have played key roles in launching the journal and today's event. Our managing editor, Eliah Bures, who you will hear from soon, has been indefatigable in putting together the journal. Kelly Jones, who is one of our editors, serves as communication director for the journal. She's going to help us stay on schedule today. And we will hear about her own outstanding scholarship in a future event. Catherine Buska is our undergraduate student assistant, and our entire editorial board, some of whom you will hear from today, complete the list. Thank yous as well go to our event co-sponsors. These include the Institute for Governmental Studies, and there in particular, I want to note Christine Trost, who spent many years with the center and who is largely responsible for its direction and success. In addition, I would like to thank the Department of Political Science, the Department of Sociology, the Institute of International Studies, the Othering and Belonging Institute, and the Center for Race and Gender. The Center for Right-Wing Studies is now over 13 years old. Frankly, this astonishes me on a personal level. It astonishes me in a kind of where in hell did all that time since go? But it astonishes me as well in terms of the transformation of the right in these years. Back then, the right was dominated by figures like George W. Bush and Silvio Berlusconi, who seem almost quaint these days. I suppose if we were to summarize in a phrase the transformation of the right since then, it would be that ideas and movements that were fringe back then, the stuff of tiny parties or seething exurbanites, these ideas and movements have now come into dominant roles in national and international politics. Viktor Orban tells us there was a world historical event that led to the dethroning of the neoliberal order and the rise of what he coined as illiberalism. That event was the financial crisis of 2008. The center's founding coincides with that crisis and the rapid series of developments that only this week saw the triumph of the Brothers of Italy. From the start, it has been one of the center's objectives to have right-wing studies established as a recognized field of study. Over the years, we have held right-wing studies conferences that have been well received by scholars from 5 continents. Right-wing scholars have been crucial in analysis of the new right that has informed the mass media. Today's launching of the Journal of Right-Wing Studies seems to me to be a major development in the continuing establishment of right-wing studies. So I thank all the people who are on the panels and all the people in our audience. And with that, it is a true pleasure for me to introduce one of our board members and my friend and mentor, Troy Duster. Troy is Chancellor's Professor Emeritus at the University of California, Berkeley. He is a past president of the American Sociological Association, and he served as chair of the board of directors of the Association of American Colleges and Universities. He is the author of The Legislation of Morality, Law, Drugs, and the Moral Judgment, and Backdoor to Eugenics. In 1976, he founded the Institute for the Study of Social Change, which later became the Institute for the Study of Societal Issues, and which is the home to the Center for Right-Wing Studies. In the late 90s, Troy chaired the Human Genome Project's National Advisory Commission on Ethical, Legal, and Social Issues. He is also Emeritus Silver Professor of Sociology and former director of the Institute for the History and Production of Knowledge at New York University. Welcome, Troy Duster.
Thank you, Larry, and good morning. In the last 8 to 10 months, we've been saturated with mainstream media accounts of how democracy is in crisis. You can't turn on the television without hearing about whether it's the trial of the Proud Boys or the Oath Keepers, whether it's the hearings of the January 6th Commission, or indeed the idea that across the globe there's this crisis in democracy. Let's take the last couple of weeks. In Sweden, the Swedish Democrats, which is the far-right party, has achieved extraordinary success and is positioned now to join the government. That's the northern tip of Europe. Move to the south, to the very tip, again, that's Italy. And what do we see? The party of Mussolini is now poised to take power. To the east in Europe, there's Hungary and Poland. Once again, the threat to democracy. And of course, we've long known about what's happening with the French on the western side, with Marine Le Pen being very successful, 42% of the vote of the French people in the last election. So we have this increased awareness about the insurgency of the right wing. But awareness is different from understanding, from a rather substantial comprehension of the forces which are economic, political, social, cultural, from immigration all the way over to the cultural issues around the notion of nationalism. So increased awareness comes when we are watching the media. But a journalist's account is often only for a certain short period, 1,000 words, which brings me to the point of the propitious moment for a journal on right-wing studies. The advantage of a journal is that it permits the authors to delve into deep economic, cultural, political issues. to engage not just in a report of what's happening in Sweden today or last week, but what's been happening over the last decade in Sweden. And then we have something called Rashomon, different angles to get to the whole picture. Or if you like the metaphor better, it would be the elephant. And what part of the elephant does a particular journalist, or in this case, what part of the elephant does the article in the journal have? Again, no matter what goes on in terms of the larger social forces at play, no one article is going to be able to capture it. The need for a journal is therefore transparent. The capacity of a journal editor is to put together all of these pieces of the elephant or the Rashomon and to come to a greater understanding of the insurgency of right-wing ideologies across the globe, from Bolsonaro in Brazil to what's happening across the globe then. This is a propitious moment for right-wing studies and for this new journal. With that, I turn to the journal panel, and introducing that will be Eliah Bures.
As Larry mentioned, I'm one of the founders. My name is Eliah Bures. I'm one of the founders of the Journal of Right-Wing Studies and also the journal's managing editor. And I want to take just a few minutes before we begin to talk about our plans for the journal in the coming months. And I will also say just a few words about the format for this event. I'm very pleased to announce that after over a year of behind-the-scenes work, the Journal of Right-Wing Studies will finally begin publishing content this fall. We have several very substantial pieces that will run on our website, and our website, in case you don't already know, is jrws.berkeley.edu. And we will also soon publish a formal roundtable discussion that brings together a diverse group of accomplished scholars to reflect on what issues are most urgent today for those concerned with right-wing politics, including both the research and policy sides of that question. Of the 13 contributors to the soon-to-be published roundtable, 4 have graciously agreed to join us today for a live discussion. So please be on the lookout for the publication of these pieces in the coming weeks. The journal's first full issue will be published in early 2023. We are excited about the inaugural issue because it brings together 8 esteemed researchers to assess the state of right-wing politics at this moment in various regions of the world. Issue 1 will include peer-reviewed essays on right-wing politics in Brazil, the United States, Western Europe, Eastern Europe, Russia and Ukraine, Turkey, India, the Philippines, and Japan. Finally, we are also in the planning stage for 2 special issues that we hope to publish in the coming months. One issue is on theoretical and methodological problems particular to study of the right, and another issue is focused on language, gender, and sexuality. The Journal of Right-Wing Studies will be very open to themed special issues of this sort and to working with guest editors and editorial teams. If you have ideas for a thematic issue of the journal that you'd like to discuss, please just get in touch. Our contact information is on our website. And of course, the same goes for anyone interested in submitting content, either articles for the journal or reviews and commentary for our blog. I suspect we all agree that something like the Journal of Right-Wing Studies is long overdue. But like any publication, we depend on our authors. So I would like to reiterate my call to please get in touch if you're interested in writing for the journal. And if you are interested, please also see the details on our website about the kinds of pieces we're looking for and the process for submission. And with that, I would like to turn to today's event. Each of our distinguished panelists will have 7 minutes to offer some thoughts on our current situation as it relates to right-wing politics. My fellow editor, Kelly Jones, will keep track of time and will alert speakers when they have 2 minutes left and when their time is up. Kelly will also introduce each of today's speakers. And I think this is an appropriate moment as well to note, off of Larry's comment, that Kelly is our communications specialist and has done more than anyone to help put today's event together. So thank you, Kelly. Once our 4 panelists have had a chance to speak, we want to first give them a few minutes to ask questions of one another or respond to each other's presentations, should they choose to do so. We will then move on to questions from the audience. If you would like to pose a question, please just type it into Zoom's Q&A feature. While you may certainly ask questions of the panel as a whole, it is more effective when possible to direct your questions to one or more specific panelists. And with that, I will now turn the floor over to Kelly Jones to introduce our first speaker.
Thank you so much, Eliah and Larry, truly. And Troy will get you back online if we can. Sorry about that. Thank you to our panelists and my fellow editors, co-sponsors, our board. I would like to also thank the ISSI staff and Catherine Buska, to echo Larry, with whom I shared many outreach and event tasks. Finally, to echo Larry's gratitude to CRWS co-founder Christine Trost, I'd just like to say that we, and certainly I, would not be here today without Christine's vision for the center and her unwavering support. Now it is my great pleasure to introduce Professor Terri Gibbons. Professor Gibbons is currently a professor of political science at McGill University and is the founder of the Center for Higher Education, Leadership, and Brighter Professional Development. Terri is the author of the book Radical Empathy: Finding a Path to Bridging Racial Divides. Beyond radical empathy, she is the author of books and articles on immigration policy, anti-discrimination politics, and comparative race politics. As an accomplished speaker, author, consultant, and mentor, Terri is using her platform to develop leaders' understanding of the importance of diversity and encourage personal growth through empathy. Please welcome Professor Terri Gibbons.
I wanted to share some of the thoughts I had about the far right. I've been studying the far right for a very long time. I started back in the mid-1990s as a graduate student at UCLA, and actually spent time in France and Germany, Austria, and Denmark, looking at what was happening with these parties. And one of the things I tried to focus in on is this idea of the radical right in context, looking at how they were impacting the party systems. And back in the late 1990s, as you may know, that we had a very typical left-right systems in these countries, but there was this big change in Austria when the far-right Freedom Party had their electoral breakthrough. And what's interesting to note is they weren't the only ones who were part of governments at the time. Italy has off and on had far-right parties in their government coalitions or supporting a government. And actually not long after the Freedom Party got into power, the Danish People's Party was in position to be supportive of a minority government. And that also led to restrictions on immigration policies in Denmark. So one of the things that I wanted to note is that back in the late 1990s, when I was trying to write my dissertation and eventually my book, people were telling me that the radical right was just a flash in the pan, they were going to go away. And unfortunately, as we now know, that was not true. And so initially, I was focusing my work on the radical right, but then I shifted to looking at immigration policy, because one of the reasons I studied the radical right is that I was interested in trying to determine what was, was there racism involved? Were there issues of immigration? And, since that time, one of the things I've looked at more closely and learned is that there's this interaction going on between issues of immigration and race, conflation, actually, I would call it. And so as we look forward to what's going to be happening with the far right, as we look at what's happening in Sweden and in Italy, I do think that what we've seen in the past in places like Denmark and Austria and other countries is we're going to see more strict immigration policies, trying to control immigration through various measures. I don't think you're going to see a blockade in the Mediterranean because it's too big and there's no way they would be able to completely block immigrants from coming, but I do think we will see it getting harder and harder to get into Europe. On the other hand, one of the things I want to mention is this shift in discourses. And one of the things I've been following closely throughout my career is the discourses that are being utilized by the far right. And what I've found is that over time, you're seeing these discourses shift into the mainstream parties, not only the mainstream right, but also to a certain extent, the mainstream left. And my colleague, Jeanette Money, wrote a paper back in 1999 that is continuously cited, because one of the things we talk about is that immigration policy, there's the control, basically everybody agrees that we need to control immigration. I mean, politicians will try to say the left is trying to open the borders, but that's not true. Left and right very consistently want to control immigration. Where you see differences in policy is on the spectrum of how parties want to integrate immigrants. And so the left definitely tends to be more pro-integration, will pursue citizenship for immigrants, whereas the right will try to restrict citizenship and the ability of immigrants to vote. So I think that's another area where you're seeing the shift in discourses that is impacting the left and the right. And so you're seeing more discourses that are restrictive on both the left and the right, but more discussions of immigrant integration on the left. So that's my comments for today. And I hope that those who are watching the video reach out. And if you have any questions, I'm Terri Gibbons at McGill.ca. Thanks.
Next up, we have Carole Joffe. Our next speaker is Carole Joffe. Dr. Joffe is professor of obstetrics and gynecology at UC San Francisco and professor of sociology emerita at UC Davis. Her most recent book is Obstacle Course: The Everyday Struggle to Get an Abortion in America, published by UC Press in 2020. Her other books include Reproduction in Society, Interdisciplinary Readings, Dispatches from the Abortion Wars, The Cost of Fanaticism to Doctors, Patients, and the Rest of Us, Doctors of Conscience, The Struggle to Provide Abortion Before and After Roe v. Wade, and The Regulation of Sexuality, Experiences of Family Planning Workers. Dr. Joffe has been bestowed Lifetime Achievement Awards by the National Abortion Federation, the Abortion Care Network, and the Society of Family Planning. In 2010, she was named the Irwin Kushner Lecturer by the Association of Reproductive Health Professionals, and in 2006, Dr. Joffe was awarded the Public Service Award by the UC Davis Academic Senate. She has served 2 terms on the board of directors of the National Abortion Federation. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Joffe, and Terri, we'll get back to you in a moment.
Okay, well, good morning or good afternoon or good evening, wherever you are. I hope 3 times is the charm. I'm hoping my internet connection will be okay. Let me start just by congratulating Larry and the rest of you involved with this journal. It's a wonderful step forward in a wonderful organization. I personally, as a UC Berkeley grad, and graduate PhD and many years ago, think of the center as the jewel of the Berkeley campus. Don't tell that to the football stadium people. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the anti-abortion movement after Dobbs. I mean, you presumably all aware that historic event this past June. After almost 50 years, the Supreme Court overturned Roe versus Wade in a decision called Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health Center. Okay, so after nearly 50 years, the anti-abortion movement got what it allegedly wanted, namely they overturned Roe. Some social movements, when they get what they want, go away or move on to other things. That is clearly not the case with the anti-abortion movement. They've made it very clear they're not going away. Rather, different wings of the movement will continue to work along the 2 main trajectories that have already been established. The mainstream wing, and I use mainstream in quotes because the mainstream of the movement in fact is quite radical. The mainstream movement will press for fetal personhood. That is to give fetuses the same legal standing as born humans, which raises all kinds of issues that 7 minutes does not allow me to go into. They also are pressing for a national ban on abortion. Mitch McConnell hinted at this right after the leak of the Supreme Court decision last May. And about 3 or 4 weeks ago, Lindsey Graham introduced a bill to ban abortion into the Senate to the incredible annoyance of his Republican colleagues and to the joy of Democrats. Now, what will become of this electorally? We will not know till November, and that is a huge question that will tell us the strength of the abortion issue. But let me talk for the rest of my time about the more extremist wing of the movement, because I believe this is of most interest to scholars like those gathered here. Certainly, the more extremist wing will continue with terrorizing clinic patients and providers. They will also strengthen their alliances with other white supremacist groups. And let me point you to the incredibly important work of Carole Mason, who probably is on this call today, although I haven't seen the list of people. Her work, which I recommend to all of you, it has, among other things, shown the deep ties between the extreme wing of the anti-abortion movement and other white supremacists, for example, at the January 6th insurrection. Now, with respect to violence, the end of Roe obviously has not stopped this. Even before the Dobbs decision, the Trump years broke a pattern that we had seen till then, lessen violence against abortion provision during Republican administrations. To date, all those who have been killed, murdered with respect to abortion, either at clinics or in some cases at doctors' homes, this occurred during Democratic administrations. The Trump years broke that pattern. Violence and aggression at clinics has increased, according to the National Abortion Federation, which tracks these statistics. Thankfully, if you can hear me knocking on my wooden desk, we have not had any murders since 2013. But what we have seen recently is a return of clinic invasions. These were common during the 1980s, but had been halted in the early 90s. When Bill Clinton took office, he signed something called the FACE Act, Freedom of Access to Clinic Entrances. And for quite some time, that put an end to the large-scale blockades that had been occurring. But that has started to come back. We've had invasions at clinics in the Midwest, and to everybody's shock, a few months ago, the abortion clinic at San Francisco General Hospital was invaded. Now, this is a clinic deep inside a big hospital. Usually clinics inside hospitals are pretty safe compared to freestanding abortion clinics. Furthermore, San Francisco, one of the most pro-choice cities in the universe, and that's quite possibly why that target was specifically chosen. This had not happened ever until a few months ago. So I think it's reasonable to expect that we will see this steady stream of violence. Anti-abortionists, as you might imagine, are enraged that even though Roe is gone, abortion is still taking place. It's still, as of this moment in time, abortion is still legal in about half the states in the United States. We will also see going forward an intensification of a pattern already in place, a conflict between the mainstream wing of the movement and the more extreme wing, which call themselves abortion abolitionists. And note, by the way, the appropriation of the anti-slavery movement. And Deborah, if you could show the first slide now. Yeah, so this is a long slide. I won't read it, and I apologize. Somehow the link where it comes from is got left off the slide. It's from something called Free the State. If you Google abortion abolitionists, you'll get to this. And speaking of appropriation, one of my favorite part, if I can call it that, of this slide is you will notice the phrase entrenched ageism. Ageism and the other isms typically are the language of liberals and progressives. This group is using ageism to say we shouldn't discriminate against fetuses. This group makes very clear it doesn't like this incrementalism. It doesn't like making deals about exceptions. It calls for the total and immediate criminalization of abortion as murder, and never treating abortion as healthcare. And I can't help but commenting on this, that abortion, big news to this audience, abortion is healthcare. And quite seriously, what we have seen since Dobbs is the absolute chaos within health, within obstetrical, gynecological, birthing circles since Dobbs. You've all no doubt seen stories in the Times, Washington Post, and elsewhere of just the chaos. Doctors weighing on the one hand, do I want to go to jail for life? And it is life imprisonment in Texas and in Alabama if a doctor does a, quote, illegal abortion. And so all over this country, or I should say all over in the red states, there is just a crisis within obstetrics. Women come to hospitals experiencing an ectopic, doctors send them away. Women come, or people who can get pregnant come to the hospital because their water broke. That's a very potentially dangerous situation in obstetrics if it happens before viability. This situation, if untreated, can lead to death, which is in fact, some of you might recall, happened in Ireland a couple of years ago, and happened more recently in Mexico. The just the chaos cannot be said strongly enough. It's not, and I should say that the legal situation of what's permissible, what's not permissible, not only with respect to treating women in obstetrical distress, but all kinds of issues within the abortion field. Our patients, is it illegal for someone from Missouri to travel to Illinois to get an abortion? That's not clear. Is it legal for a doctor in California to do telehealth with somebody in a state like Texas where abortion is banned? So all of which is to say the healthcare, which this group says it should not be part of, is in chaos. And finally, Deborah, can I have the next slide?
Carol, we're at 8 minutes.
Pardon me?
We're just at 8 minutes.
We're at 8 minutes. I will.
That's okay.
I will finish right this second.
Sure.
Okay, so I just want to finish by pointing this to you. A very important distinction between the extremist wing of the movement, abortion abolitionist, and much of the mainstream abortion movement is, till now, the mainstreamers have said, we're not going to blame women. They are victims. It's the abortion industry. It's the abortion doctors who are at fault. And these people are saying, no, if you murder your kid, you're guilty. So anyway, I will stop here.
Thank you so much, Carol, Dr. Joffe. Such a complex issue. We're going to move back to Terri now. Let's try again, Terri. Professor Givens, you're on. All right.
Okay, I'm actually, why don't we let somebody else go ahead while I am still trying to figure.
No worries. Yeah, thank you, Professor Joffe. That's a tragic, it's a tragic moment Speaking next is Dr. Ângela Figueiredo. Dr. Figueiredo is Professor of Social Sciences at the Federal University Recôncavo de Bahia in Brazil, and is associated with the graduate program in Ethnic and African Studies and the postgraduate program in Interdisciplinary Gender Studies at the Federal University of Bahia. Ângela is also the coordinator of the research and activist group, the Angela Davis Collective. Dr. Figueiredo has produced 2 documentaries. In English, they're called Ebony Goddess, that was in 2004, and Dialogues with the Sacred in 2013. She curated the Global African Hair exhibition that took place in Salvador, Bahia. Ângela has published 3 books, and in English, they're called The New Black Elites, Black Middle Class, and Black Beauty. She has written several articles on Black feminism in Brazil, including Decolonial Black Feminist Epistemology in 2001 and Letter to Judith Butler from an Ex-Mulatto Woman in 2016. Please welcome to the panel, Professor Ângela Figueiredo.
Thank you, Deborah. Thank you for the invitation to today's event and to the launch of the journal. And thank you for the opportunity to share some insights into this difficult moment in Brazil, a moment in which right-wing ideology and movements are at the forefront of politics and Black activism refuse to be silent. I would like to thank Professor Stephen Small, Professor Lawrence and Kelly Jones, and Deborah for the invitation. The political context of Brazil in recent years, especially the period between the removal of President Dilma Rousseff government in 2016 and the far-right government of Jair Bolsonaro in 2019, is characterized by the loss of social and political rights and an increase of the rate of unemployment. As many people here today already know, Brazil has the largest population of African descent outside of Africa. Brazil has 205 million of inhabitants, and according to the Brazilian Institute, Black Brazilian, they call pretos and pardos, are over than 53% of the nation's population. Can you hear me well? Okay, thank you. In Brazil, there are currently 40 million unemployed people, while 33 million people have nothing to eat. We have seen an increasing case of police violence, racism, violence against cis and trans women, as well as gender violence in institutional politics. According to Atlas da Violência, between March 2020 and December 2021, there were over 2,000 cases of feminicide. The economic and social crisis generated by the COVID-19 pandemic that has already killed over 680,000 Brazilians in the war in Ukraine have affected all countries with increase in the price of food, medicine, and oil. Unemployment has led many people to live in the street, marked this period as the one with the largest number of homeless Brazilian people. In addition, the increase of fake news and advertising in the daily life of politics is worrying, particularly when the fake news embrace a discourse that tends to minimize the devastating effect of the military dictatorship, which occurred in a period between 1964 and 1984. Brazil probably has the largest number of domestic work in the world. There are about 6 million domestic work, 92% of them are women and 68% are Black women. This is the context of Brazilian and Black people Brazilian now. On July 8, 2022, a Bolsonaro elector, Jorge Guarano, shot and killed the treasurer of Work Party, Marcelo Arruda. at his birthday party. This continued to growing wave of political violence that has characterized Brazil, nation, and Latin America and the other countries and the world in recent years. This violent phase in Brazil is also marked by the murder of Marielle Franco in March 2018, a case that still remains unsolved, as well as by the murder of Moa do Catendê in October at the same year. Mestre Moa was murdered by a Bolsonaro elector inside a local bar in his neighborhood. In addition to advantage of far-right policies in Brazil, we see the effective threat to democracy through the dismantling and disaccrediting of democracy institution. Guns are spread in Brazil. According to Brazilian Army, the number of registered shot and collector has reached the 1 million mark. The data show that the number of weapons in the hands of CRWS that has tripled since December 2018. In response to the rising right-wing government and their support, social movements have reacted to challenge them. Notably, the Black women's movement has articulated itself and sought effective response, including denunciation on social network, political mobilization in the street, and by highlighting solutions through the recognition that without racial equality and gender, there is no democracy. Political campaigns are being articulated to mobilize for election at the municipal, state, and the federal level with the slogan, "I vote for Black women." By doing that, Black movement and Black women's movements seek to make the population aware that without Black women in parliament, there will be no significant change for Black and people in Brazil. We know that in moments of crisis, nationalism discourse occupy a central place in the political representation. I have some difficulty in some words, sorry. The widespread idea that right-wing government or even military dictatorship can establish order and the social pact through the force and the violence of the state, unfortunately permanent in Brazilian social imaginary. Some of the questions that are prominent in our reflection and the challenge right-wing movement are: what are the reasons for the growth in the extreme white ideology? What political, economic, and social achievement and projects have been presented to convince the population that this is the best path to follow? Faced with this question, I outline here some possible answers given by the research who has traditionally perceived and interpreted the world in its dynamic from a left-wing point of view.
Pardon, Ângela. Ângela, I hate to interrupt, but we are at 7 minutes. Please continue. But wrap up.
How many minutes I have?
We're out of minutes, but please wrap up and
Okay.
yeah, thank you.
Okay. Let me see. So I try to talk about some issue like the way that the issue of rights of indigenous people, because until now I'm talking only about Black people, appear in political speech where they suggest that in Brazil, there is a lot of land for a few native people. For this reason, deforestation and genocide have been authorized in order to expand the space for illegal mining, which invade indigenous land through laws and is fined and punished inspectors born. Violence in indigenous lands has grown dramatically. The most recent case, nationally and internationally reported, was the murder of Dom Felipe and Bruno Pereira in June 2022. But there are a lot of indigenous children, adults, and people who die anonymously on defending their own existence. So, there is another issue that we can talk later. Thank you.
Yeah, I would love to hear more. Everyone would love to hear more in the Q&A, and I'm so sorry to cut you short.
Okay.
Thank you, Ângela.
Thank you.
Our next speaker is Professor Daniel HoSang. Dr. Daniel Martina HoSang is Professor of Ethnicity, Race, and Migration, Political Science, and American Studies at Yale University. His most recent book is A Wider Type of Freedom: How Struggles for Racial Justice Liberate Everyone. And he is co-author with Joseph Lowndes, who's on our board, of Producers, Parasites, Patriots, Race, and the New Right-Wing Politics of Precarity. Through the Yale New Haven Teachers Institute, he has taught seminars for K-12 public school teachers on anti-racist curriculum and pedagogy, and works with teachers and youth organizing groups in Connecticut on teaching about racism and racial justice in the K-12 curriculum through the Anti-Racist Teaching and Learning Collective. Thank you for joining us, Professor HoSang.
Great. Okay. Hi, everybody. Thanks so much, Kelly. Thanks for all the organizing. I know all the work that goes into these. Our time is short, so I'm going to just jump right into it, share some slides and images with you, and just outline this really quick. There's just going to be 3 parts here. In the first part, and I'll start sharing now, I'm just going to share a couple of examples of some of the work that Joe Lowndes, my colleague, and I have been doing on kind of new dimensions and sites of right-wing politics, unexpected ones. Then I want to have us just think together about 3 of those in the contemporary sense, and to really pose this question, kind of who is the right wing? Where is it now? And then to think a little bit looking ahead about the kinds of frameworks that might allow us to answer these questions. So a few years ago, Joe and I worked on this book together, Producers, Parasites, Patriots. And one of the kind of sites we took up and we were drawn to was the kind of growing presence of a range of both like Black elected officials, grassroots activists, and other folks of color kind of on the right, and noting that unlike an earlier generation of Black conservatives who often wanted to downplay their racial identity, kind of deracialize themselves in a colorblind moment, all of these figures, their kind of racial biography, identity signifiers were actually quite significant to their uptake in the party. So Mia Love in Utah, Senator Tim Scott, Alan West, and others. Even the Tea Party in 2015, you could see the kind of growing presence of a certain sense of a multiracial right that was being articulated to its politics. Until recently, the president of the Heritage Foundation, Kay Coles James, a Black woman who long talked about her experience growing up in Jim Crow as a kind of way to describe her entry into conservative politics. We also looked at, on kind of far-right grassroots formations, the kind of surprising presence of a range of leaders of color in groups like Patriot Prayer in the Northwest, the Proud Boys, and others. This is Joey Gibson, who we interviewed for the book, Tiny Toisi. This was the kind of front of far-right grassroots activism. And they were always talking about kind of their identities as men of color and how it articulated to these groups, sometimes trolling their critics among liberals. How can we, how you're calling us white supremacists, look at us, that can't be. And thinking here, these are striking photos. This is the Proud Boys putting up, what's understood often as a gesture to white supremacy, and these kind of diverse groups doing that. So that was based on our earlier work. I want to now, in the just last part, have us think together about potentially other sites, about who is it that constitutes the right, and talking a little bit about the grassroots right, the kind of corporate right, and in some ways the feminist right. Joe and I are now working on a project, an edited volume with a range of contributors to try to understand, since 2020, to many, many folks' surprise, after Trump's, 4 years of often blatant racism, nativism, misogyny, his 2020 voting returns among every group, minoritized group, non-white voters, increased, particularly among Latinos. So this project we're working on is trying to understand in very specific and kind of grounded ways, how do we make sense of those identifications? Sometimes we read these images as they're simply a distraction, they're a gesture, they're insincere, they don't mean anything. They're being manipulated. And that there's dynamics of that, to be sure, in the party, but we think there's a different, a more complex story at work here. And so many contributors are kind of exploring these. And again, you can see these figures and sites. Some of them are more itinerant, experimental, some work, some don't, but there's a clear sense that this kind of dominant default that all minoritized voters and groups are naturally kind of preordained to identify with liberal and democratic politics is kind of under stress. Think about Mayra Flores, who won in the Texas border. All of her voters who support her, are they on the right? Are Dene Native voters who came to the Native Americans or Trump rally, are they on the right? The Blexit folks encouraging Black voters to leave the Democratic Party, is that the right? The second site, I want to just spend a little time, and I want to thank an organizer named Ann Hendrickson at the Center at Collective Power for Reproductive Justice for drawing my attention to this. This is Evie Magazine, which I think began publishing about 3 or 4 years ago. It's now, and it has a very large circulation in both print and online. In one sense, as you can see from these images, it's a pretty recognizable, it defines and constitutes itself as a women's magazine with stories about kind of fashion, beauty, celebrity culture, health, etc. But there's a very, very clear, unmistakable, kind of pretty strident right-wing, and one could argue bumping up against kind of fascist narratives across that articulate not just traditional conceptions of femininity and gender roles, but actually articulate a range of right-wing positions through this kind of lifestyle magazine. So here's just some examples from recent issues. Birth control and eugenics, can you name a more iconic duo? My husband caused a scene when someone yelled at him to put on a mask, and it was honestly super hot. Hot husbands hate masks. So these unexpected sites here, a feature on Candace Owens, but kind of the kind of conservative media commentator, but drawing from her as a kind of like lifestyle fashion issue. And I'll just as the last one say, a not insignificant portion of the movement against Roe has come from young women who are very, very have fluency and kind of stay connected to longstanding feminist themes of autonomy. So I think there's something happening between what that magazine is articulating and this work that's worth our attention. The last side, I just want us to think about this. Jones Day is a huge, huge corporate law firm that's been around for decades and decades. This book recently came out that documented their connection to the Trump administration, but they're essentially a run-of-the-mill corporate law firm who has done a lot of work for Trump. So are they on the right? Is the kind of corporate arm of liberal capitalism that has many, many convergences with Republican and right-wing politics? Is that part of the right? And so just looking ahead in the last two, I want to suggest that to get our heads around these questions, we have to think about some of the limits of the dominant frameworks used to understand right-wing politics, which has often been a focus primarily on parties and institutions, thinking about singular explanations for right-wing identifications, something about the economy, the changing demography, status loss, and again, presuming that liberalism and liberal politics is somehow the default or norm for all minoritized groups. And for the projects we're working on and we're trying to learn from, we're really thinking about studying the right as dynamic, moving, contradictory. that we have to examine right-wing politics also in relation to the broader crisis of the liberal order of governance and markets. And finally, that we'll learn from local situated studies that really are animated by these new questions. What's at stake for folks? What's their vision? How did they get here? Thanks, and I really look forward to our conversation.
Thank you so much, Professor HoSang, and that was very on time. Let's try Terri again. We have a few minutes only before going into Q&A, and oh, it's lovely to see you. Good.
Yes, I'm here.
Go ahead.
So I had to switch to my phone to get this to work, but in any case, I'm happy to be here. And so I've been saying that the pain. And
Terri, I think you'll need to turn off your video.
Yeah, you're right.
You're breaking up.
Okay, video is off. Can you hear me okay now?
Yes.
Okay. So as I was saying, I've been studying the radical right since the mid-90s. And back then, people were saying that they were going to be a flash in the pan and disappear. And by 2005, when my book came out on voting radical right in Western Europe, it was a time when the radical right was still on the rise. And so thanks for showing my website. That's my book, Voting Radical Right in Western Europe. And I was studying Austria at the time, Denmark, and of course, France, Germany, and of course, a little bit of the UK. And what we've seen since then, I really have an interest in the discourses of radical right. And what we've seen since the late 90s, early 2000s is a shifting of the discourses from the radical right to the mainstream right. And my thesis back in when I did that first book, if mainstream parties maintain the cordon sanitaire, as we call it, or kind of a distance from the radical right, back then, the mainstream right parties were embarrassed to be connected to the far right. And would actually say, we're not going to go into coalitions with them. Well, that's obviously changed. And we see that in Sweden, we see that in Italy. Of course, Italy has a much longer history of this, and not just because of fascism, but even back in the late 90s, early 2000s, they were coalitions there. But in any case, I want to point out that, this shift in discourses has really created a shift in the broader discourses, and at the same time as we've seen a decline in left-wing parties. So left-wing parties have been doing much more poorly in Europe, and that there is this power struggle developing in Europe that's going to define the policies of the next few decades. And as we see this resurgent right, as we see what's happening in places like Hungary and Italy and so on, are we going to see this shift continue, or are we is the left going to be able to recover? And so this is a broader story about party systems. It's not just a story about the right. I remember when I was first starting my dissertation, my working title was, the radical right context. So I wasn't only doing interviews with, far right parties. I was all, let's see, can you guys still hear? Yeah. I was what your strategy again. And so I'm going to stop there because of my time. I'm not going to risk losing my internet connection again. But I just want to point out that the rise of the radical right has led to a shift in the discourses, that the mainstream right has seen value in taking on the discourses of the radical right, but it has also empowered and emboldened the radical right to be even more in front of the public, and they're in terms of getting support across the Atlantic, which I could talk about further, and that we need to take a look at the broader party systems and how that's changing. The frozen party system that we learned about when I was in graduate school has completely disappeared, and we need to pay more attention to what's happening in the push for right, as well as what's happening to the
Thank you so much, Terri, for being, adapting, and everybody's palate is wet to dive into your research later. I'm now going to hand the floor over to Larry, Rosenthal, Dr. Larry Rosenthal, whom I also want to thank deeply for everything you've done for the journal and for the center. Please, Larry, go ahead.
Well, thank you, Kelly, and thank you to all our speakers and for the patience to deal with sort of electronic difficulties. Let me just say that I find the presentations really compelling. They all bring up questions for me. So, for example, Terri's question. Terri pointing out that mainstream right parties have both accepted the discourses of the far right and at the same time thereby empowering the far right. It brings up the old metaphor of riding the tiger. Can the standard, the historic right-wing parties actually control these groups? President Hindenburg could not. The King of Italy could not. What do we think, or Terri, what do you think about the future of the capacity to control these parties, to continue to ride the tiger? And Daniel, what an extraordinary a project you're involved in, of kind of mapping the right and dealing with, no, the right isn't a constant. It's something that is changing as time goes on. I found that the particular issues that you raised, the particular examples, were very compelling. What you point out in Evie is something that I haven't been familiar with at all. So you're on some kind of cutting edge, I think, and I applaud you for that. And similarly, looking at the corporate sector as a whole, as perhaps part of the right or perhaps the liberal sector. What I would love to hear more of is, have you come up with any conclusions about why Blacks and Browns, in fact, turned more toward Trump in 2020, and should we expect that to continue? Ângela Figueiredo, the compelling quality of what you had to say was moving in many ways. You talk about the loss of social and political rights, and that the general sense of a mindset which says that the military can produce order is something that is in the world of the current rise of the right wing, of illiberalism and so forth. Brazil seems to me to have a unique location in that while all of these movements have this nostalgia and talk about a golden age, in Brazil, that golden age is a military dictatorship. I don't know that any other of these movements talks about that. And the presence of violent attacks on women and the racial component of it was very compelling. But I wonder if you can comment on the tying of the Bolsonaro regime to the golden age, as it were, of military dictatorship. And finally, Carole, Joffe, whose kind of finger on the pulse of what's going on around abortion is extraordinary. You know, the division into fetal personhood versus the national ban is quite compelling. I'm curious about the question of violence. That you point out that violence did not occur under Republican administrations by and large, but that changed with Trump. Do you think that the current chaos in illegal chaos owing to the Dobbs decision is going to result in more violence? You know, there is a whole lot of conversation, both on the right and in the mainstream media, about quote unquote civil war. And the analogies to 1860 and the late 1850s go on. But one of them that seems particularly compelling to me is that the lead up to the Civil War had two different legal systems with respect to enslavement. Is there a parallel to the development of two different legal systems? Already you point out chaos. Is there something yet more worrisome about the coming of two different legal systems? And with that, I will give the floor over. Thank you.
Eliah is sort of moderating this Q&A. So Eliah, please take it away.
I can do that. And I want to echo Larry in saying that these were very thought-provoking presentations, and to just thank our panelists for their time this morning. And I also want to remind our audience to please use the Q&A feature to pose questions, which I will then read to our panelists, and when possible, to direct your questions to specific panelists. In other words, use the Q&A feature, please, rather than the chat. First, though, I want to give Terri, Carole, Ângela, and Daniel a chance to maybe respond to Larry's extremely rich reflections and response, and also to respond to one another's presentations. So would one of you like to say something in response?
I can start. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Great. Okay, so the question about riding the tiger is an important one, and I think we're still in the process of seeing how that's going to play out. In the U.S., obviously, Trump is taken over the Republican Party to a certain extent. Well, pretty much. But in Europe, it's a different situation. You saw, we're seeing that the SPD in Germany has had a comeback, but we haven't seen a similar, comeback in France of the left, not in the way the Parti Socialiste and the communists and so on, and of course the rise of Marine Le Pen. The broader question is, are the mainstream right just going to morph into the far right? And I think that's what we've seen with the Tories in the UK and what we're seeing in the US. And in Hungary, actually, it was more of a far right party but that has become mainstream. And I think that it's a different kind of far right, I think, than we saw, in the interwar period. So it's a far right that has been trying to become palatable in some ways, by not being too extreme. But I saw there was also, to bring up I talk about the issue of religion in the context of, for example, being anti-Muslim, and that's a big issue in Europe. And then, of course, in the US, it's more anti-immigrant in terms of people coming from Mexico and other parts of Latin America. So I always refer back to Ari Zolberg's piece, is Islam like Spanish? And I think, how parties respond to this issue of, the Muslims in Europe as well as in the US, and then, of course, Latin American people from Latin America in the US more so, is going to, are they going to vote? Or are we seeing, with Daniel's and Joe's piece, are they going to become part of the far right? I mean, there's this transition period we're in, where we're going to have to see, does kind of religious conservatism play into the radical right and how people vote? So I'm not giving a clear answer, but it's very complicated, obviously. So thanks.
I can now respond to Larry, if that's okay.
Yes, please go.
So Larry, you're asking basically, will the chaos that I'm describing lead to more violence? I think, well, yes. And I mean, I also think we'll be very localized in some cases, but I think a lot depends on the election. I mean, there's been a lot of hype that abortion really will change everything for the Democrats. Would that it would be so, but who the hell knows? I mean, there's now an emergent line that, you know what, the Democrats peaked, the Republicans are coming back. We'll see. I mean, what's happened so far has been extremely encouraging. The Kansas vote, where red state Kansas voted decisively in favor of keeping abortion in the Constitution. I mean, that was quite telling. And which also leads me to speak to one of Stephen's questions. Leads me to speak to one of the points that Daniel made. I mean, Daniel is sort of making us say what's right, what's left. I mean, what do these things mean anymore? And what's to me fascinating about Kansas, and this may speak to one of the issues you're raising, Daniel, is the same Kansans who voted overwhelmingly for abortion, most likely, when the November comes, they will vote again for Republican senators and legislators, although Kansas does have a Democratic governor, and we'll see if she makes it. So I think abortion is yet another issue, Daniel, that may fit into your framework of not entirely clear, people who support it, people who don't support it. Where do we put them? But with respect to the issue of violence, I think if the Democrats do well in November, and if the consensus is that abortion played an important role, yeah, I think we'll see even more violence. But even if the Democrats don't do well, as long as there is abortion happening anywhere in the United States, all the clinic directors and providers that I am in contact with, both in the red states and in the blue states, are assuming that there's a lot already, and most likely there will be more.
Well, thanks. I can jump in just to build off of Carole. It was making me think, this question about what's the matter with Kansas is, takes on new meaning in this kind of context, right? Or I guess just to respond first, I think to Larry's question, there's many different things happening at many, many sites. The reasons, for example, that Trump made, significant gains in South Florida among Latinos, Venezuelans, Cubans, some Puerto Ricans is quite different than what's happening in the Rio Grande Valley. It's different than what's happening among African Americans in the South and the Midwest, et cetera. And so that's part of the idea that we can find some kind of single conclusion. Sometimes it is about the aftermath of Cold War anti-communist politics. Sometimes it is about faith and religion. Sometimes it is about gender. Sometimes it is about kind of new grassroots-based political formations that are shaping these politics. So that's why, from our perspective, when Joe and I are taking up this project, I think we have to learn what's happening like on the ground in all of those places to see. There's not, I don't think, a unified form. I will say, Joe has made this point that the right is often today strongest when it actually has a certain kind of fluency of liberal discourse, which is to say that, Charlottesville in the US in 2017, the Unite the Right rally was in many ways a kind of political disaster. That face of the right as revanchist, culturally supremacist, we will not be replaced, is not the kind of point of entry to kind of expand and enliven and animate its base. And so I think it's striking that we've seen a move away from that and towards, I mean, even if you look at like something like the 1776 report that Trump puts out in the wake of the 1619 report and the debates about critical race theory, in many ways, that report is not about the kind of cultural supremacy of the West. It's the right suggesting they're defending kind of individual normative rights, objectivity, liberal values at the expense of the kind of the left that's lost its bearings and has no interest in everyday people. So I think that's one thing. It's about the ways that multiculturalism and kind of the story of civil rights triumph has so shaped the ground of almost every political claim that's happening. And that doesn't mean, sometimes it's like, well, does that mean they're kind of like a more inclusive right? That I don't think that's the point we're trying to make. I think we're saying that they can articulate many of those politics, the politics of purification, the politics of kind of trying to figure out who the parasite is, and articulate them through those liberal and multicultural norms. So that's part of what I want to kind of lift up. And I think certainly a question I have for other panelists and others is, the extent to which we're seeing these kind of like polyglot formations of the right outside the US as well, including in Europe. Thanks.
Ângela, would you like to say a few words?
Yes. Thank you, Lauren, for the question. In Brazil, there is a widespread idea that the mobilization made by the Black movement in 1978 broke the ideology of national identity that was mixed. So the general idea is the dictatorship, they keep the order within the inequality. So there is significant evidence that the Bolsonaro victory in 2008 election was a response to the growing identity politics, that they make connection with the Partido dos Trabalhadores. The coming out of the close of many groups, they broke the general idea of the national identity in Brazil is mixed, but it was represented by white men or upper middle class. So the question is, I think that people feel like in Brazil now, you can't talk about national identity because Black people broke this general idea. Do you understand me? Yes. So a lot of people explain the Bolsonaro victory because they say the work party given a lot of opportunity to grow in the Black social movement, women movement. So they changed the Brazilian imaginary in the ideology. Like now in Brazil, because you have affirmative action, a lot of people comes from the upper and the middle class. They fight against affirmative action because they think that they believe that universal citizenship. So I think that it's because of this people has one idea that during the dictatorship, the Brazilian world was more comfortable, of course, for them, for the Brazilian elite or Brazilian upper class.
Thank you, Ângela. We have a flood of questions coming in, which is fantastic. I'm trying to keep on top of things here. I think I'll start with one from Sihan Tugal, which I think is very well put. He writes, can we really understand the rise of the far right in the West without studying its consolidation in the rest of the world? In Russia, Turkey, Hungary, and so forth, the far right has been in power for a very long time. Aren't these regimes showing the way, and isn't the West following? And that question reminds me of a line I believe I heard recently from Peter Pomerantsev, who writes on Putin's Russia, who suggested that the future happened first in Russia and its other countries that are following its lead. And so I just wanted to pose that to everybody. To what extent can you understand the far right and recent developments, the resurgence of the right in the West on its own terms, and to what extent do you have to see it in a global context?
I can jump in first.
Please.
One of the things I try to emphasize is that there's policy learning, political learning on both fields. People are learning from the is funding the far right in Europe, and there are people in the U.S. funding both the far right in the U.S. and in Europe. I mean, there's a lot of action on that I think we need more attention to. About the connections between anti-Islam groups in the U.S. and Europe. So, for example, Geert Wilders, coming to the U.S. Republican Party Congress, and then the Hungary's leader coming to CPAC. I mean, we're seeing these connections happening. So it's not just that they're learning; they're actually working together, and getting funding from similar sources. And so it's something I think we haven't done enough looking into, and we need to pay much more attention to.
Thank you, Terri. Does anybody else want to grab that question and speak to it?
I can say a little bit to that.
Yeah,
which is that what Sihan refers to is this widespread concept among right-wing regimes, illiberal regimes, that they in fact do represent where history is going. I referred to Orban in calling 2008 a world historical event, the financial crisis of 2008. And what he argues is that liberal democracy proved itself incapable of dealing with the 21st century, and that and this kind of refers back to things like Fukuyama saying this is the end of history, that liberal democracy now would be what dominates the world, and this notion that the future is illiberalism is a kind of object of faith in this right-wing world, which includes places like China as well as India and so forth. So in a way, Joe Biden has articulated this as the confrontation, the historical, what we are living in is the historical confrontation of authoritarianism and liberal democracy. And it's an answer to this premise on among these right-wing regimes that they represent the future, or that the future has already occurred in Putin's Moscow.
Stephen, do you have a comment?
Yeah, I wanted to make a comment. Thank you very much. Yeah, fascinating presentations, wide range of issues. I find it highly stimulating. I'd like to bring in the issue of religion, organized religion, and the ways that different organized religions, whether it's Catholicism or Christianity, evangelical Christianity, or the opposition to Islam or to Muslims, or articulations by people who are ascribed to be Muslims, and the role, and ask the question, what role does religious beliefs play in this? What role are they a foil for other kinds of issues? And what can we learn from that? in particular, I'd also like to bring in a region of the world. I like these global discussions, these comparative discussions. I think they're extremely useful. For example, the fact that Ângela mentioned indigenous issues should remind us that issues around indigenous and Native American populations within the US are also very prominent. But one region we haven't mentioned is Africa and the more than 50 nations in Africa. And it's clear that there are strong and strident movements and statements by top politicians that are anti-gay, that are anti-abortion, in populations where the vast majority is Black, even though they may not define themselves as Black. So I think there are a lot of comparative insights that can shed light on, what's going on at the global level, but also that can be a mirror for beginning to understand some of the specificities of what's happening in the United States. One final example, we know that opposition to affirmative action in the United States is still there. It's not as visible as many of the other issues. And Ângela didn't get a chance to talk about this in Brazil because of time, but affirmative action is a key fulcrum of opposition and of right-wing movements in Brazil. Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Stephen. We had a similar question to your first point come in, and it was directed at Daniel. And somebody in the audience asked about the role of Christianity, and particularly Christian nationalism, in helping the right to mobilize or appeal to non-white voters. I think I'll just throw that open to the panel, but perhaps specifically to you, Daniel, and also perhaps to Ângela. How would you respond to that?
Yeah, it's an important question, an important site for us to be thinking with. I think that just, as a more general observation, that a lot of what we're seeing are these kind of references to faith, right? And I think that the signifier faith is doing certain work because it's supposed to stand in contrast to another kind of technocratic corporate liberalism that is uninterested in people's kind of interior and spiritual lives. So for figures then to claim, I'm a person of faith, faith is guiding me, faith is important, that's to me part of what so much of this registers is how do you inhabit a place that dissents from what appears to be a kind of failing, crumbling liberal order. I think institutionally, it's not as clear, at least among the groups that we're kind of thinking about and with, whether, formally Christian nationalism is actually the, a kind of really important influential causal force. Because I think partly what we're also seeing is, South Florida, like South Texas, most of the Latino voters there identify as Catholic. Their Catholicism didn't orient their politics to the right in the same way it is now. So even that is changing. The Catholic Church itself is changing. Black churches in the South, which had historically been this really important, especially in the last 50 years, kind of site of political formation, especially for Democrats, they're shifting also their congregations, who goes to services, et cetera. So I think it's more about shifts in the institutional and kind of cultural order of religious institutions as against a singular kind of explanation.
Thank you. And Ângela, do you want to pick up on that?
Yes. Bolsonaro has the highest percentage of evangelical electorate. Everybody knows this because there is a maintenance of conservative agenda about what Bolsonaro call gender ideology. That is against identity. So the most important for Bolsonaro election was the vote of evangelical people. That is so conservative. Even they are against to affirmative action that Stephen Small mentioned before. So you have the upper class and middle class. They are against affirmative action, but some of evangelical, that was poor people, they are from the lower class. They are against because they don't understand was the role made by the race for the racial inequality. So the vote prominent for Bolsonaro in Brazil. It's our, I'd say, we are worried about this now because the election in Brazil will be next Sunday.
Yeah. Can I add
Okay.
something about religion and abortion?
Please do, yes.
Yeah. Well, obviously, in the United States, the Catholic Church, along with evangelicals, has obviously been a huge factor in anti-abortion movements, funding them, and so on. But there has been pushback. Liberal Protestant denominations, Jewish denominations have really tried, especially since the Dobbs decision, to put pro-choice ideas front and center. One very intriguing thing that has happened, and I have no idea where it will go, but a number of Jewish individuals and organizations in Florida have actually sued, arguing that a ban on abortion violates their religious ideals. I mean, it is part of the Jewish tradition that you must have an abortion if the woman's life or health is threatened. So we will see what comes of this. Just one more interesting thing. I had a long talk yesterday with a colleague who is studying the abortion issue in Ireland, and we were discussing how come after so many years there was a referendum that actually legalized abortion. You know, and I mean, there was two main factors. One was the issue was the incident I brought up earlier of about a Hindu woman in Dublin who died because she wouldn't, even though she was very ill, there was still cardiac activity in the fetus, so they wouldn't give her an abortion. But the other issue that my colleague talked about is simply the huge decline in the legitimacy of the Catholic Church in Ireland. I mean, they simply could not deliver the votes anymore.
Thank you, Carole. We have a couple of questions. I'm going to try to curate and consolidate here to the best of my abilities on the fly. We have one question that asks, and this is particularly to Daniel. The questioner writes that you write extensively about relationality in racial formation, and they're wondering when the quote unquote grassroots multiracial right, which is always dynamic and co-constitutive, when you get to the point where you know there's too much change that nothing remains constant. And we have another question that's similar, but it's less in terms of the contemporaneous and more historically related. If right-wing political movements and ideologies tend to change, they tend to adapt, as they obviously do. How do we trace continuity over time? What makes today's far right like the far rights of the past? So these are questions I think that are very interesting in getting at the issue of how we group things together and how we assess continuity and change, both in our own moment and then over time. So Daniel, I'll pose that first to you, but if somebody else on the panel is interested in picking that up, by all means.
Yeah, thanks. This is, I guess, such a helpful and provocative question, and I think it shows the limits, right? We can imagine these like issues that we often thought of as like litmus test issues around reproductive rights, immigration, affirmative action, that were just would allow one to kind of easily sort out who stands where on the spectrum. And certainly in the time, Joe and I spent, especially with thinking about the groups in the Northwest, those far right groups, we're really struck by just this kind of like this array of issues, right? So they have a critique of big pharma. They actually can talk about mass incarceration. There's a really robust discussion about mass incarceration on the right because it stands in for a certain kind of like state power and authority run amok. But they'll use a term like the new Jim Crow to describe some of that work, a critique of concentrated corporate power, a certain sense that like immigration politics is less about the folks who are not admitted and their worth and more about the exploitation they're subject to by employers. So I just say that to say that, I think for us, we're beyond the place of typology. right? I think if we're looking for recurrent moves, there is some sense, though, that a broad array of crises can be addressed by a return to a certain kind of like market logic that's unimpeded by the state, a skepticism of a certain kind of state intervention, the kind of, almost like a eugenic impulse around purification, that thinking about the nation's kind of stock and qualities and characteristics are resonant. So that's how more I think about it, is a set of narratives that kind of, loosely tie these together as against any concrete kind of policy positions, which I think vary more widely than we might imagine. And the last thing I'll say about the relationality question is there is a way that, and there was a question here also about articulation. There was just a story about how the CIA now has a statue to Harriet Tubman that's being built in its headquarters, extolling Tubman as a military intelligence officer par excellence, right? So, wow, right? Taking someone who's associated with such long-standing ideas about Black freedom against state military power and incorporating her in that way. That's happening everywhere. It's not new, but I think those kinds of articulations, taking familiar symbols, ideas, and histories, and helping them to open up new kinds of politics is absolutely widespread. And I don't think just critiquing it as kind of, hey, you can't do that, works. Tubman is going to be on the $20 bill, so she's standing in for the nation in other kinds of ways. So we're seeing these kind of very complex articulations everywhere.
Thank you, Daniel. Does anyone else want to pick up that question briefly? Go ahead, Stephen.
Actually, talking about continuity, I wanted to take the opportunity to mention two things quickly. First of all, the Harriet Tubman statue reminds me that, statues and monuments are central symbols in many of these right-wing movements, whether it's Christian statues or symbols, or whether it's Confederate monuments in the US, or statues of Winston Churchill and William Gladstone in Britain and elsewhere. So they play an important role. And I wonder how they play a role elsewhere. I also just wanted to point out, in terms of Daniel's insightful comment about the ways in which familiar symbols are rearticulated, I do see that Howard Winans is in the audience and has posed a question. And I wondered if we could give some attention to that question.
You meant Howard Winans' question?
Yeah, Howard Winans, obviously with Michael, are the at the forefront of looking at the rearticulation of symbols. And I just see he's there, and I saw his question. I wonder if we can bring that in.
Sure. I was going to go next to one of his other questions. But
Sure. You're in charge, Eliah. You're doing a fantastic job. I don't wish to preempt you. I just wanted to mention that.
Thank you. We'll come back to that if we have time. And I on the issue of time, we're at about, I think, an hour and 35 minutes. And we had anticipated having a lot of questions and a kind of a lively conversation, and going until the 2-hour mark. So I think we'll keep going. Our panelists have graciously agreed to stay with us and give us their time. So yeah, the question I was going to raise was from Howard Winans. That's why I was wondering which of the two you had in mind. He asks, or he observes that very little so far has been said about the crisis of masculinity, and observes as well that this is a worldwide source of right-wing mobilization. The crisis of masculinity there is not unpacked and would need to be unpacked, but presumably could mean the decline of men as sole breadwinners in families, or perhaps the sense that some people have that being a man's man is now impugned in some parts of the culture. I will open that up to everyone, but perhaps first I'll address that to Carole. Do you have any thoughts on that, on the crisis of masculinity as something that perhaps drives right-wing politics today, and particularly anti-abortion politics?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And thank you, Howie, for the question. And again, let me refer people to Carole Mason's work. I mean, she's really been the leader in this. An early book of hers, Killing for Life, very effectively shows how much returning Vietnam vets played a key role in the more kick-ass wing of the anti-abortion movement, seeing the failure in Vietnam as a failure. It's a failure of masculinity, it's a failure of doing what needed to be done. And so they're going to save the fetuses because they will be an army that can do that. So yes, very, very, very pertinent to the anti-abortion movement, which for the most, the rank and file, the shock troops are mostly women, but disproportionately, most of the leaders of these movements, and certainly this is the case of the abolitionists that I talked about earlier, have been men.
Does anybody else want to jump in on that question briefly? If not, we can move forward. We have an interesting question. It speaks to my heart. I'm very much a humanities person. My background is in history. And this question is directed particularly to Daniel, but also I think if anybody else has thoughts, they shouldn't hesitate to jump in. And the person writes that it seems that many of these talks and much of the scholarship on the right in general comes from the social sciences. Are there particular ways that literary studies, with their emphasis on textual analysis, can contribute or is contributing to our understanding of the far right? Yeah, so not just sociology and political science, but yeah.
Yeah. This is a great question and something for us to absolutely think about together. I think it's right that like social science logics and frameworks, which are, have long been, but increasingly about causality, and trying to find kind of parsimonious like explanations of forces, sometimes give us a limited kind of repertoire to understand the complexity of what's on the ground. So here I think we return to the work of British cultural theorists like Stuart Hall, who in the late 1970s similarly trying to understand Thatcherism as a formation that kind of captured the imaginations and interests of kind of working class folks in Britain, primarily, though not exclusively white, that invited, asked us to look beyond so-called material interests to think about what was at work in kind of constituting those longings and identifications. So here we're actually taking very seriously symbols and narratives and themes, and identity as an open-ended process as a site to do that work. And I think it's just a great model. And it also just requires us to imagine even the folks that are coming into these formations, thinking about how they relate to their lives, their loved ones, the people they care about, as complex, contradictory as we all are, rather than simply that we can hand them a survey, they can tick off their interests, and we can place them in some kind of spectrum. So I think that's precisely the modes of inquiry we need to help get our heads around some of these questions.
Thank you, Daniel. Does anyone else want to respond briefly to that?
Can I say something about the masculinity?
Yes, please.
Yeah. On the last September 7, when we celebrate the Brazilian independence, Bolsonaro's speech was about his sexual performance. The idea of he represents himself like a strong man and opposed to a weak male that he called maricas. All the time in this debate is when you talk about vacune against COVID, Bolsonaro have indicated the masculinity. So there is any example on you can make a connection between right wing and the masculinity, strong masculinity. Bolsonaro is the best example to think about this.
Thank you. I want to move on to another question, which kind of, I think, builds off of the truism that all politics is local. Somebody Right. And maybe I'll direct this at Ângela first, but again, I'm open to really anybody who feels they have something to say. Suggesting that a lot of our discussion has been about right-wing politics at the level of states, the level of nations, the level of regions, and to what extent we can only really understand the far right, their successes, their activism, by looking at the local level, by really local studies. And one of the first questions that came in actually ties into that a little bit. It's a very Berkeley focused question. They ask about where the proposed development in People's Park might fit into the discussion about the right-wing resurgence. And somebody will have to fill us in on what the proposed development in People's Park is, but that could be an interesting way to take this question, whether or not there's a right-wing political angle to what's happening there. So Ângela, I'll open that to you first. Just the general question of understanding these questions and the resurgence of the right today through the local as an indispensable lens. But also I'm curious if anybody has anything to say about the People's Park angle on that question of the local.
So if someone wants to answer before me, I'll say thank you because I need a little more time to think about and organize my mind.
Well, as the only local, as the only Berkeley, I believe on this panel, just to fill in everybody who's not from Berkeley, People's Park dates back to 1969 or 70. It was part of the whole, it was liberated Terri. It's a piece of land, a block or two from the University of California campus. It was taken over. Over the years, it has remained very much a symbol of the 60s, of the repression of the state. Someone was actually killed. A person named James Rector was killed during an encounter right opposite, diagonally across from People's Park. There was all kinds of demonstrations. Over the years, there's been various attempts to accommodate, to have social services on site. That seems to have gone away. It's basically become an encampment for the homeless. Periodically, the university has said it needs space, it needs a new dorm. So the most recent thing was the attempt to build a new dormitory that would have spaces for a certain number of homeless individuals. However, the first day of construction, demonstrators came, the people doing the construction, and Larry or Kelly, anybody else who's Berkeley based, tell me if I'm not getting this exactly right. But the first day of construction, there was protests, and the workmen left. They said, "We are not safe here." So it's at the moment it's at an impasse. That's my understanding. What the right-wing angle of this is, I don't know. I see People's Park as very much, in some senses, the last remnant of that generation of the 60s and early 70s, itself a descendant of the earlier free speech movement. So I would love to know from the questioner or from anybody else what the right-wing connection is, but those are the facts.
Yeah, if I can add a little bit there, throughout the right wing, especially certainly in the U.S. and I think also in Europe, the right sometimes characterizes the oppression that they feel that they're living under as the 60s have come to power. The 60s are in power. And in that sense, the People's Park as a symbol of the 60s is relevant. I would add one other thing, that it was People's Park that made Ronald Reagan a figure nationally, because he sent in, I think it was National Guard, to deal with the protests against building, and it has that capacity to make, when a symbol becomes a place where actual confrontation happens, People's Park seems to retain that capacity.
Yeah.
So
Thank you, Larry.
Can I say
Yeah,
something?
Angela, please jump in. Yeah.
Okay. I think that on local level, Marielle's murder has strengthened the struggle of Black women. Marielle murder is a symbol for us. The struggle against the number of women that now running in these elections grow significantly. There is no example in our history. And the phrase that without gender and race equality, there is no democracy, I think that is an answer for the right wing and also for the left, because the general idea about democracy, we interrogate. So there is no democracy for us.
Ângela, could you just tell people briefly who is Marielle Franco? Some people may not know.
Stephen, can you tell for me?
Who is Marielle Franco?
Marielle Franco she was born in Rio de Janeiro, in Maré. She was the political involved with the PSOL, the left party, and she was murdered in 2018. And until now, they didn't resolve the question of Marielle murder. So Marielle Franco became a symbol for us. So I'm a part of a movement called Marielle Franco Movement. The Marielle Franco now is so important. It's the symbol of the Black women's movement in Brazil.
Thank you, Ângela. I think we perhaps have time to squeeze in one more question, and I will abuse my prerogative as the moderator here to go to the question that remains that I personally find most interesting. And I want to direct this at Terri Givens in particular. Somebody, and this is actually, I believe this was Howard Wynant's question from earlier. It asked about how right-wing forces rearticulate the meanings of race, gender, sexuality, and labor, and particularly why the right wing needs to take over terminology and concepts from left-wing and democratic movements. Why do they need to do this? And what does this say about the continuing power of social justice movements? And it also, the question, I think it touches on some of the other presentations we saw earlier. So the idea of, I think sort of Carole's presentation, the idea of the pro-life movement as abolitionists, obviously kind of piggybacking on the abolitionist movement of the 19th century, or the idea of anti-abortion as a human rights cause. So clearly, picking up on kind of leftist and progressive language and themes, but repackaging them for right-wing purposes. And I'm very curious how much people read this as a deliberate strategy, to what extent it really is explanatory when it comes to understanding the right-wing resurgence of recent decades. And why do they do this? And how does this speak to the enduring relevance of or the enduring power of social justice movements, as the questioner asked?
Okay, hopefully you guys can hear me okay.
Okay, go for it.
Okay, so basically it's about expanding their appeal. If you go back to the early 2000s, the far right was, their electorate was very different, and but then they started to appeal to working class voters, and that really impacted. There was a kind of back and forth between, the reaching out to working class voters, and working class voters then became more interested in the far right with the anti-immigrant sentiment and so on. So they're using terminology that is designed to appeal not just to kind of the traditional, older, radical right voters, but also to working class voters, and more recently, women and kind of traditional approaches. So I mean, I can to go into more, but it's complicated. But I think they're taking on a lot of this terminology because they realize who they're attracting and they're trying to adapt.
Thank you, Terri. I think that question may have originally been directed at Daniel. So we have about another minute and a half or so before we need to move toward wrapping up. Daniel, would you like to say something to that question?
I guess I want to maybe just like orient also just as we're at the end of time, which is that I think that we're in a place where, like the scholars on this call, but many others, I have students who are increasingly, interested in these questions, some of whom actually joined groups on the, conservative student groups. Like it's a moment that's very, very much kind of up for grabs in this sense. And I think there's a task, and this is, why the journal will play such a critical role in thinking about what we can produce collectively beyond the stories that, each of our respective research unearths. And I think that I just wanted to, just since I know we have a little time, that really feels like the challenge now is building a broader multi-site, kind of interdisciplinary theory of the kind of ongoing dynamism of right-wing politics and formations. And so I just, I'm looking forward to the journal playing that role, but being on this call today was also a reminder, for all of us, and for me in particular, about how it is that we can both take our research and make it accessible to others who are sharing questions, explorations of the right, and how we can learn from them as well. Does that make sense? So it's kind of like on the aggregate, what are we trying to do together here that will never be fulfilled by, otherwise atomized projects?
Right.
Eliah, let me just say one thing to the replication on the right of themes from the left that has a long history, and it was especially prominent. I think, in addition to what Terri pointed out, it's prominent among those on the right who see themselves as revolutionary, and that the left seems to be the people who have more successfully articulated what revolutions should be and so forth. So you can go back to the teens of the 20th century, where, for example, I'll just give one example, the Italian nationalist movement, which would eventually be folded into fascism, which is, incidentally, word was not appeared much in this conversation, which is itself interesting. But that movement, the Italian Nationalist Association, appropriated Marxism and for on national terms, and would refer to Italy, for example, as a proletarian nation. So that kind of adaptation has a long history, and is particularly prominent among those who really see themselves as revolutionaries on the right.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. As a historian of European fascism in the 20th century, it's by no means unusual to see these kinds of appropriations by the far right, the revolutionary right on the left. Mussolini was famously first a socialist. Zev Sternhell's work has gone into this in extraordinary detail. So I think that's absolutely right. There's nothing new here in a way. Yeah. Well, this has really been fantastic. A great discussion, great presentations. I think we're coming up on our time limits. I want to thank all of our panelists, everybody who's been involved in organizing this and in speaking, and also thank our audience for fantastic questions and for their presence and just everybody's support of the journal as we're getting things off the ground. And with that, I will shut up and I will hand the floor to Larry for a final comment or two and a final thanks.
Well, I don't know that there's time for a comment or two, and perhaps my final comment was that about revolution. Although, as I suggested, the unspoken concept here or word has been fascism. We haven't talked about that. It's significant, I think, because in Italy, to take the current example, the incoming regime uses the phrase post-fascist to describe herself and her party. It's a phrase that was first made popular by the leader of that party, or the predecessor of that party, in the 90s in Italy, Gianfranco Fini. But the question of what is the relationship of the current right to historical fascism is particularly significant, I think, with respect to questions of violence and paramilitaries, and which have certainly a huge weight in the USA post January 6th. With that, I would like to thank the panelists who have been remarkable. I would like to thank everyone for their patience with our difficulties electronically. I would like to thank the organizers. I would like to thank Deborah, who has been behind the scenes in all of this, and Eliah for both Eliah and Kelly for making this thing run smoothly. And thank you above all to our audience. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.